welcome.
Thank you.
I have lots of questions when I've seen the films a couple of times, and I can't tell really what is more important, whether it's the language in the text or it is the visual experience that you have. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the relationship between both and how they come together.
They're both, I think, very, very important, but chronologically the text comes first, absolutely, before anything else. And it usually takes a couple months for me to research and write a script. And usually by the end of that, I have a pretty good idea of what the characters look like. And kind of by the time I'm into a script, I'll start sharing with Pat some of the details of the scenario, what the characters are like, and Pat will start responding with ideas for the broader context, the set, animations. We work together on the props, so yeah.
Yeah, and I think to your question, there's always, I mean, the way we work together has evolved a lot and continues to evolve, but there's always been this interest in making the visuals rhyme in terms of the language and making them kind of work along the same vein of formalization. So like as soon as you hear the text and you realize it's formalized language, we always wanted the visual image to be formalized as well, and to be this sort of other than natural space.
Do you think this sort of very formal language and also the formal aspects of the props and the set and the scenery and all of that, the costumes, help the audience to sort of identify more with the characters, get more involved with the story, or is it the opposite?
Well, I think it's undeniable that the formal reduction of the human face to kind of a drawn face, particularly like by the removal of the eyes, makes it feel estranging. Makes the characters not human. But I think in a way that does allow for a different, more symbolic identification, kind of like when you see the smiley face, and you kind of you smile back at it, kind of without thinking. So I think it's people are really capable of strong symbolic identifications with the characters, and also with the rhythmic voice. People know rhythmic voice from so many things, from song, from religious ceremony, and so I think people enter quite easily into those formalized and more abstract elements of both the voice and the human figure. And
I read a statement of yours where you spoke also about that in relationship to sort of it being sort of a political statement, and to a certain degree. And I wanted to sort of like maybe understand a little bit more about the relationship between the films and sort of the political ideas that maybe sit within them.
Right. Well, I've definitely, the word I've used sometimes to describe the films, and particularly the speech, not just because it's formalized, but because it goes by so fast. And I've called them polemical, which is, a kind of a usually politicized term. And I also think that the black and white kind of hints that the characters come from a space where they're very convinced, their world is black and white. They see things one way, and usually something that interests me very deeply, and although it's a personal characteristic, it has many manifestations in political and communal life, is self-deception and vanity, and not being able to see something, particularly something about yourself. So, when Sadie meets Jack, she doesn't obviously realize that what he wants
What
from
he's
her.
after,
Yeah. And in the case of the last film, This Is Offal, in a way, although the woman starts out and it's a given before we start that she is dead, she kind of seems to realize at the end that she's really dead, So I think that
there seemed to be a struggle, no? It's like the moment of death in some way, where she's sort of struggling with still sort of being alive and refusing to sort of move over to the next phase.
One way we've talked about it and how I keep thinking about it is that in the last film, the character who rises from the table is not the person of the dead woman. It's like just literally the body, just like the organs are just the organs. And it sort of feels like at the end the body sort of returns to the person and therefore is really dead, like really realizes that she is not just this scientific object.
The stark contrast between the black and the white, I feel like this is a contrast, or that all of those films live from contrast. So it's not only the black and white that is the contrast. Like in the last film, for example, we see the organs bickering with each other, and it's quite humorous. And at the same time, the overall story is actually rather tragic. And I feel when I watch the films, they have all these sort of various elements that's standing in contrast to the other, where it's often very dramatic, tragic, grotesque, and then something can be extremely funny. And I know that you have also thought about the films as a collective experience that you want to share with the audience that often reacts to these type of contrasts. And I wanted to see if you could maybe talk a little bit more about this idea of like a collective experience.
Well, sure, and just kind of on the way to addressing the collective experience, when you talk about the contrast, the most, I think, important or the initial contrasting element, even before the black and white or before the graphic look of the characters, is the idea of the pun and, two or more meanings in one word. And I think that's the kind of origin, contrast, source, and everything kind of builds out. So the pun and the wordplay are really, really at the heart of the work, and everything kind of stems from there. And I think one of the really interesting things about wordplay, and I didn't start writing or really reading verse seriously until I was in graduate school for painting, and but I just kind of fell into it and then got very, very into it and started writing.
What was it that you read first?
Well, Sadie is the third of 4 films we made about the First World War, and so we both got very, very invested in that history and in the art forms that came out of it, Cubism and Dada. But once I got more into the art forms, I realized how extremely critical poetry was to the cultural response to the war, and you really couldn't understand the war unless you read a lot of the poetry. But I don't want to just say poetry. I want to also include verse, because some things like music hall, which were considered very middle-brow or even low-brow entertainment, these are just often very ingenious songs full of rhymes and puns. And you had poems very famously written in the trenches. At the same time, you have people like Eliot and Pound in London, and they're kind of making another revolution in modernist poetry. So you have all these ways to kind of interpret the First World War. So that's kind of the story of how I got into it. But so the communal experience, I think that one of the great things about wordplay is that you don't make up a pun, you just find it. It's already there. And so sometimes, I remember when I was writing Sadie and I wrote the line, Britannia waves the rules, I was like, oh yes, this is awesome. And then I Googled it, and then I realized that this is, The Guardian reuses this headline like every year, you know. And so
It's just too good.
It's
you know?
so good.
Someone
It's
must have
too
come up
good.
with that before, but
Exactly.
and I hadn't heard it before, so I was like laughing, and so that was really good.
Well, but it's funny because it's just like, you know, people invented gunpowder at the same time in different ends of the world. It's
Exactly.
like we live in this communal space of words, and so you don't, unless you're like a very real neologist like Shakespeare or even George W. Bush, some might say, you don't make up words, and and you just kind of have to take from the communal dish. And so, when we get the wonderful opportunity to share films with a group of people, I really think it does change it because people listen to each other listening to the work, and they might laugh at something and encourage other people to react.
You also already hinted a little bit on the relationship that you have both in working together, and I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about how that process between the two of you unfolds when you begin working on a film.
Yeah, like Mary said, it does begin with the text, and when it gets to the point where she's willing to share it with me, which, you know, is totally understandable when you're really pouring yourself into a certain project, a written project. You have to reach some threshold of comfort with it before you can share it, and then when it gets to that point, I think that's one of the great things about, or can be one of the great things about collaboration, is when I'm introduced to the text, I am sort of free of all of the burden of the work. And so when I'm hearing it, I can completely indulge in visual imaginations of what it could become. And then we can start bouncing those ideas off of each other. And, you know, I think that is really sort of the most pleasurable part of the collaborative process, is this, it's almost like binocular vision, where you have these 2 points of view, and this third thing that couldn't happen otherwise kind of happens. And then just sort of learning how to trust that, because there's obviously this sort of yielding that goes on in terms of the sort of unitary control over a process. And then it just sort of goes back and forth from that point. And when we're actually shooting, that process is probably the most kind of a live wire response, where we're just really kind of winging it. And that's part of the reason why we really prefer to work on our own. We do everything ourselves, so that we're not, I mean, like when you think about the sort of filmmaking model where it's very organized and you have shooting days and whatnot, we're not like that. It's a mess, but we prefer to work that way because it's more akin to our sort of understanding of art-making process, from where we come from the physical medium, painting and photography and all that.
I mean, I guess it's great to work together. It's also difficult. The moment when I kind of hand a page over to Pat is often like extremely nerve-wracking for me, not because I think you're not going to like it or be unsupportive, but just letting somebody have permission to weigh in on your own, what has so far been your own creation. And it's because we're not trained filmmakers, we're really not trained to share. And so oftentimes it is kind of, I mean, usually when I'm writing, I will often like have an idea for a scene, and you know, when Pat and I start storyboarding, which is really one of the few processes in which we are actually both in the room trying to figure out the same problem, you know, I'll say, well, I've always thought of it like this, and Pat will be like, no, obviously it should be like this. And when it's a better idea, it can really be difficult like you have to do the right thing and take the better idea, and but so it is kind of like a continual crushing of the ego, but then when we do finish something or we like figure something out together, then that's a very, very great feeling.
So how is the moment when the work is finished and it's initially presented, which is perhaps sort of like similar as if you finish the script and you hand it over, only that you're now confronted with a much larger audience that sort of like looks at it perhaps with a sort of critical eye. I've spoken with other artists recently about this particular moment once a work goes out into the world, and several of them told me that that's a moment that they don't actually even really enjoy. What they really enjoy is the making. And in your films, I can feel so much the joy of making it because of all the details and the focus and concentration on the text, and like everything is so particular and thought out. So do you share that type of feeling, or is the actual presentation and the reaction important to you?
So I guess if you're asking about kind of what our initial emotions are when we're like first presenting a work, well, sometimes I actually get nervous because very often we're working on something up to the very last minute, before it's presented. And for example, this last film, we were working on it until we got on the plane to come to Switzerland and install it. And sometimes I get nervous that people are going to ask me a really good question right away. And because, when we install the film in a gallery or museum or whatever, usually it's the first time we've seen it big. Up until then, we've seen it only on a computer screen. Yeah. And so oftentimes we're kind of seeing it for the first time too. And I totally sympathize with the artists that have told you that it's uncomfortable to have people like, watching it.
It's not even uncomfortable, it's irrelevant to them. It's sort of like, I just want to make the work, and if it's seen or not, that's like secondary.
Are these all men?
No, they're actually women.
No, I
mean, I had a conversation with Rachel Rose yesterday exactly about that, and she was the one who said, like, I feel like that the audience don't even understand what I'm doing, so why should I show them my work? It's like throwing pearls before pigs.
No, I was teasing. I don't necessarily think that emotion is divided by gender. Sometimes it's conditioned. It depends on how you were raised. And men can feel very sensitive that way too, for sure. But I always feel like what people have to say is usually quite relevant, which is, I've tried to stop reading my reviews. And just based on, people that I actually care or trust, talking to them and, hearing what they think, that's become more important to me than things that are written about the work. But it is, for some reason, I do really care what people make of my work, and although it sometimes can hurt, or it's also taught me a lot, and the questions that people ask over and over have given me a lot of insight that I wouldn't have gained in any other way. For example, oftentimes when we show the work at a school or something, and people will ask questions, and sometimes the questions can recur, and one question that we got a lot was why it was always me playing things, and I was always kind of frustrated by the question until the question's recurrence made me realize that it was very important to me to play the characters, and that, kind of like, there are just some art forms in which the person that's writing and the person that does the performance, it's important that it's the same person. And like in some genres of music, like singer-songwriters or MCs, it's very usual that Jay-Z writes his own lyrics. We don't necessarily expect the same thing from Katy Perry. It's just they're different genres, and it was just important to me that I be the one to say it. And I wouldn't have realized that if I hadn't had all these questions from mostly students.
I think, and when that question would come up, at least earlier on, we would have different answers for it if we were both responding, because I always encouraged Mary to be the one playing everyone, just partly because I wanted to see the sort of follow through from writing all the way to the presenting the characters.
Have you collaborated from the very beginning on the films? And has the collaboration changed?
It's changed quite a lot, because when we first started, I was still teaching full time, and it was kind of like, felt a little bit more like I was jumping in at the end to do the shooting and then some of the post-production. But then over time, my involvement began kind of earlier in the process, earlier and earlier, to where the good thing about that evolution from my perspective, kind of technically, was that we shoot everything on green screen so that we can basically create these collages. And when I was over time able to become involved earlier on, we could do more anticipation of what problems we would be solving in post-production. So, and then of course, that technical advantage leads to linking it more with the text and the humor and everything. So it has evolved quite a bit, and now, I mean, I'm kind of involved kind of at the beginning to some degrees, and then sort of more and more.
What you just described about really being part of the process from the very beginning and doing it all yourself and playing the characters yourself sort of like reminded me a little bit of Cindy Sherman, who, believe it or not, really does all of her work completely on her own. And there isn't even anybody photographing it. She does that as well. I mean, that's sort of like really astonishing to me, that all of it is like just done by herself with no assistant, no one in the studio. How do you think, like, since we saw like 3 films now from different periods, and I think they sort of span probably about 8 years now, what would you say is a sort of like progression in your work, and where do you see it developing?
Well, I think kind of an obvious progression is that, as Pat said, maybe the first 4 films, I was thinking of them as my work, and Pat was helping me make them into time-based work. But then we really started collaborating together full-time in about 2010 or 2011, and then they became, I think, much more realized as films. Before that, I was just kind of, standing in front. It was recitation, and recitation is really still what I think I do. I prefer the word recitation to performance, but they've just become more involved as films, as Pat's been involved earlier and earlier.
And I think for me, one thing, just thinking about that question, one thing that I think has happened is that as I've more embraced it as my own work as well, I've let my interest and fascination with early cinema and actually even sort of theater set kind of ideas seep in more and try to let them work with the text more, and just kind of taking pleasure in that historical aspect to the visual ideas.
Yeah, I have to say that I find the films incredibly theatrical, almost to the degree where I would say this is actually just theater on video rather than video or film, and I'm thinking sort of like about absurd theater like UNESCO or Beckett, or even something more contemporary like Richard Foreman, especially Richard Foreman, I think, sort of like it comes to mind. And I was wondering if there's any sort of particular point where you would say this was sort of like an inspiration, or there is really a relationship to something that is theatrical, or comes out of like this sort of history of drama.
Talk about the middle film.
Yeah, with Swinburne. I mean, ironically, some of it's sort of meta-historical, I guess, because with Swinburne's Pasiphae, one thing we were actually looking at was Fellini and the Satyricon, and his attention to, there's at least one moment where there's this attention to sort of the live performance and the sort of crude street theatrical drapery being the backdrop and coming in, and that sort of counting on the audience to fully complete the believability of the set and the space, and I really enjoy that kind of acknowledgement that the viewer is going to completely get it, even though you're giving them kind of a bare minimum notion of what's there. And then and also kind of Renaissance theater machinery and that sort of early effects work of theater has really become more interesting to me.
And we don't move the camera very much. In fact, as little as we can. And so we try to treat the available space of the 16:9 format, to fill it as much as possible. And I've always thought that I treat it like a painter, but as we've worked together, neither of us had a background in theater, but we started realizing that theater was much more comparable to what we were doing than film.
I've seen many directors who moved from theater into film, and when you look at their first movies, they do exactly the same thing. They have no experience in working with camera, and it's a sort of frontal situation, just the way it is in your films. Has Brecht ever played any role in your thinking?
Well, he's definitely somebody that's really active in the early 20th century, which is a period that's really meant a lot to us. And I think of him as... Especially
the first film,
yes,
kind of like had a relationship for me to that, with the sort of working class woman. And
I think how formally rigorous he is, and sometimes stark, and how that is connected to his own style of polemicism or of politics, and the way that, visually, formally, and politically, the way he sets up the stage for a type of speaking that he is interested in that way, very much.
I was thinking about the three-penny opera in some way when I saw the first film, because it's not like Brecht on his own, like in his very ultra-formal political way, but he collaborates with Kurt Weill on that sort of like operette or whatever you want to call it, and it sort of felt to me a little like that. And I also felt like that the characters or protagonists constantly break through the fourth wall. They're always sort of like going to address the audience. That's why I really felt like this sort of very theatrical character of all the films. So why don't we open up, and unless you have any other comments you'd like to make? Yeah, let's have some questions. Why do you always appear in your own films?
I'll tell you again.
Hi, thank you. There's so many questions. The production itself is very complex, and I'd love to know more about that. But what I wanted to know about is you mentioned your text being important, and that's your first line of work. But the stylization of the character, it seems to me, for me, it reminded me a little bit of the Comedy d'Art and that. But I wasn't sure if you were where did that inspiration come from? And so it's almost like a drawing coming to life. So I wasn't sure, because it almost got in the way sometimes for me in terms of listening to the words. So I just wanted to get a little more information on that.
You mean kind of the visuals?
The visuals, the stylization.
Yeah. You go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking of when we first started, we were steeped in this World War I historical era, and one thing we were looking at a lot were cartoons of the time, George Harriman in particular, and Crazy Cat.
Yeah.
I mean, we could say almost that the eyes almost come out of that, and
Yeah,
at
the
least
eyes
partly.
for Sadie and kind of the vertical ovals are straight out of Crazy Cat. Yeah, Snoopy, actually, the very first film we made, as you know, Snoopy has this alter ego as a dog-fighting First World War pilot, and he was the visual inspiration for the first film that we made. Yeah, it's interesting, the idea of some parts of the films distracting from other parts of the films, I think, happens constantly, and so there's kind of, we think of the type of stress that we intend to put on the viewer, and so we want to stress, the ideal type and kind of stress for the viewer, and one of the the ways we reduce it is we try to keep the work short. And of course, we're a little bit counteracting that by making you watch 3 films in a row. So that is really overwhelming. But so one concession is keeping it short. So if you want, you can watch it more than one time. Usually, when we present it in a museum or gallery setting, we give the text, because it's impossible to get all the jokes in the first listening. And that's something that we like, and it creates a frustration no matter what. And the more that we have showed the work outside the U.S., in Germany and in Belgium, where usually people speak excellent English, but it might not be their first language. And of course, one of the real proofs of real fluency in language is knowing all the slang and the jokes and the idioms and the puns and things like that. And so watching people who don't speak English as a first language treat the films, it made me realize that there's not really, it's almost just as frustrating for native English speakers as it is if you don't, if English is your second or third language. And I think that maybe for those people, they are maybe relying a little bit less on the language and maybe keying in more to the visuals. But I think that definitely the film set kind of an impossible bar for the viewer. And I think that it can cause stress. But I guess it makes, we often think of, what we really prize in our own, like our favorite artists or our favorite works, or, the best type of experience we can have. And oftentimes it's been when, speaking for myself, my first reaction wasn't like immediately thoroughly favorable, and I kind of had to come back to it. And as a painter, this is one of the wonderful things about painting, and is you can come back to your favorite paintings again and again and find something new. And we try to make, videos that function in the same way. But I do want to acknowledge that, there's kind of a built-in stress to the viewing experience.
Hi, and thank you so much for being here and sharing your work. I was struck by the fact that these 3 different films not only did you make them at different times, but they're historically set in such different time periods. And I was also thinking about the question you say you get all the time, and it strikes me that these are so much about embodiment and giving a voice to these overlooked female protagonists from various historical moments. I mean, literally about embodiment in the case of the last film. So I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that feminist through line in your work, and maybe a little bit about what you're working on now or next, if you are.
Thank you, Lori. In the last, well, we've spoken about the First World War as a historical context, and the second film comes from a mythological context where the time is a little bit less clear, like you might be in like California in the 80s or something, and you might be somewhere else, which is something that we learned basically from our year in Rome, which in Rome, the great thing about it is you have like a medieval church next to like an ancient temple, next to like, a super shiny, Porsche dealership or something like that. And so this is the wonderful thing about Rome, is seeing all these time periods cheek to jowl. In the last film, I really thought about the context not being a time or a character, a set of characters that we didn't invent. The Minotaur, Ariadne, these are things you kind of pick up from the myth and you reuse them. But the environment being the body of the character. And so really we're not so much like in the morgue in the 70s, which is kind of when we said it. We're in her body, and we're listening to that internal angry-ish dialogue, the blaming that happens not only, well, it's a horror film, and it's a ghost film. Like when the dead get up and start talking, you're in the realm of art or possibly religion. So it was kind of fun stepping very straight into that type of genre and that type of character. But yeah, and taking the entire film straight into the body of the character.
But I think you should mention Thomas Hood and how with the last film I'm going to speak for you, that it was Mary's response to this Thomas Hood poem, The Bridge of Sighs, which is written from a male's point of view, viewing this drowned woman who had killed herself in the Thames. And it's all his monologue, kind of blaming society.
It's an early-ish piece of social justice literature. It's from the 1840s, so very early Victorian London, and Thomas Hood was a friend of Charles Dickens, and so they kind of shared this interest in kind of looking at their community, their society, and making critiques of it, and doing so while they were also making a work of art. And The Bridge of Sighs is one of Hood's most famous poems, and Baudelaire translated it. And Baudelaire was a great admirer of Hood. And the scenario of the poem is the male narrator finds a woman, he pulls her body from the Thames and laments over why someone would do such a drastic act. What type of torment must she be under? Was she abandoned by a lover? Was she starving? And the narrator's kind of castigating the city of London. You call yourself a moral city. How could you let this happen? But conveniently, the woman is very beautiful, and which is drowning victims usually aren't, from what I understand. And but the theme of a beautiful dead, often drowned woman is a recurring one in Victorian 19th century literature. It happens over and over. Poe actually says in one of his literary essays, I really like his literary essays. They're very much like how-to, and so he says, how do you make the most emotional impact? Well, it has to be as beautiful as possible, the poem. And so the most beautiful thing is a beautiful young woman, and you have to make it as sad as possible, so she has to die. And that's the way to make the best, most emotional, impactful poem ever. And his work bears that out, and so does the work of a lot of his cohorts. Yeah.
But then with your rewriting or your version, it's not even a version, but the way This Is Offal comes out is it's the woman is speaking, the body is speaking, sort of this turning it around.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, I really admire Hood's poem, and but I did want to put the woman in a speaking role, and even though, you know, Hood's empathy is really, the empathy and the artwork are totally entwined. That's why it's such an amazing poem. But the woman is very, I mean, dead is like the ultimate decorum. I mean, you can't talk back, and you can't swear or sass. And so in bringing in, you know, imagining a scenario, a ghost scenario in which a dead woman speaks, you know, she's not only is she like going against the laws of nature, but she's going against ideas of decorum. And I guess both are important to me.
Do you have any other questions or comments? Well, in that case, I'm going to thank you very much for sharing the work and for the conversation. Thank you.